Imagine for a second like you're moving into a new house.
Oh, I love that feeling. Just a total blank canvas.
Right, exactly. It is a total blank canvas. You can change the paint colors in literally every single room. You can swap out the rugs, rip up the carpet.
Rearrange the furniture 100 different ways until it's just right.
Yeah, until it perfectly suits your exact personal style. It's all entirely flexible. But if you take a sledgehammer and try to knock down a load-bearing wall just because, you want an open concept
The
kitchen,
entire house is just going to come down right on top of you.
it really is. Because in any structure, some things are just decorative. You can change them whenever you want. But some things are, well, they're structural. They actually hold the whole thing up.
Right.
So, welcome to another deep dive. Today, we are taking that exact architectural reality and applying it to human belief.
And honestly, it is the perfect visual for what we're digging into today. Because when we talk about worldviews, people rarely stop to audit their own internal architecture.
Oh, totally. We never stop to figure out what is just a nice decoration and what is actually holding up the roof.
Yeah.
So to do this, we're looking at a specific reflection from a devotional series. It's titled Day 6, First Importance. And it's based on a pretty famous piece of writing from the Apostle Paul in the 1st century.
Right. Specifically the opening verses of 1 Corinthians 15.
Exactly. And our mission for this deep dive is to figure out what actually happens when you try to build a worldview on, decorative feelings instead of load-bearing historical facts.
Which is a huge distinction.
It is. And we're going to look at the sheer psychological chaos of how the original witnesses processed those facts, and frankly, why the people chosen to deliver this message were such a spectacular public relations disaster.
Honestly, that public relations disaster is actually my favorite part of this entire text.
It's so good.
It really is. We are going to synthesize the historical layers of what Paul is doing here, along with the raw psychological layers of how human beings actually process world-altering news.
Right, because the material we are looking at today, it doesn't let anyone just float around in the spiritual clouds.
No, not at all. It forces the reader right down to the gritty historical ground.
Okay, let's unpack this. Going back to our house analogy, in any worldview or belief system, you have your decorative truths. Like, if you are looking at modern religion, the decorative truths are things like traditions, personal preferences, the style of the music, or even the architecture of the building you meet in.
You can change the paint color.
Exactly, you can change the paint color. But then you have the load-bearing truths. And the opening lines of our source material hit this incredibly hard.
They really do.
The devotion argues that Paul defines this load-bearing truth very explicitly by calling the death and resurrection of Christ matters of, quote, first importance.
Right, and the core argument here is that without these specific chronological events, the entire structural integrity of the belief system just completely collapses.
Yeah.
Because Paul isn't offering a philosophy here. He is offering a sequence of historical actions. The text points out how he draws these really fun lines. Christ died for sins, Christ was buried, Christ was raised, Christ appeared.
But wait, let me push back on this for a second, because I think a lot of people listening might have a very different default setting when it comes to this stuff.
Sure.
Like, in our modern culture, isn't faith usually described as the exact opposite of firm historical lines?
Well, absolutely.
We tend to talk about faith as a clever spiritual idea or a private feeling that you just hold on to when things get tough. It's treated like an internal coping mechanism.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is how aggressively this text rejects that modern assumption.
Really aggressively.
The author explicitly argues that this message is not a private feeling. It is news rooted in history. And we just have to pause and realize how entirely that shifts the category of what we are even talking about.
Right. Because if faith is just an emotional state you try to achieve, a sense of inner peace or mindfulness, then it is entirely dependent on you.
Exactly. But this text forces the reader to grapple with faith as a reaction to an event that happened outside of them in the real world.
That makes total sense. I mean, if my belief system is built on a private feeling, then it is entirely dependent on my mood,
Yeah.
right? Or my circumstances.
Yep.
If I wake up exhausted and cranky, or if I lose my job, my feelings change. And if my feelings are the foundation, well, my load-bearing wall just crumbled.
That's a great way to put it.
But the text makes this incredibly stark claim. It says, the resurrection stands on witness, not wishful thinking. It is planting its flag in history.
And placing the foundation in history is actually deeply vulnerable.
How so?
Well, think about it. If you tell me you have a private spiritual feeling, I can't really argue with you. It's your feeling. It's totally safe from criticism.
Oh, true. I can't disprove your feeling.
Right. But the moment you claim something happened in physical space on a specific day in history, you are inviting investigation. You are saying, go look at the evidence.
Which immediately moves us from the claim itself to the people who supposedly witnessed it.
Exactly.
And if this isn't just a warm private feeling, if it's a shocking, rule-breaking historical event, then the people who first saw it wouldn't have felt peaceful.
Oh, not at all.
They would have lost their minds, which totally explains the utter panic we see in the text.
Yeah, it's pretty chaotic.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The devotion outlines a specific theme for this week. It says, fear meets facts, then faith.
Mm-hmm.
I just had to stop and stare at that progression when I read it, because it is incredibly realistic.
It completely bypasses the sanitized stained glass window version of the story we are so used to seeing.
Exactly. When human beings are faced with something seemingly impossible, something that shatters all the fundamental laws of reality as they know it, they do not just jump straight to serene, blind faith.
No, they don't start peacefully singing hymns.
They panic.
They absolutely panic. And to give context to this, the source material points us to the Gospel of John, chapter 20, which details the morning of the empty tomb.
Right.
It describes the disciple Peter running and stooping and staring into the evidence. He is looking at linen cloths, lying in a place that just hours before held a dead body.
Wow.
It's not a worship service. It's a chaotic crime scene investigation.
Yeah.
The author notes that Christ was alive before their hearts were calm and before their thoughts were clear.
Fear meets facts. I love that. They are terrified, their worldview has just been flipped upside down, and they are staring at raw data, like an empty tomb, discarded burial clothes, just trying to process the impossible.
Right, and that psychological reality is crucial for understanding what the Apostle Paul is doing in 1 Corinthians 15.
Okay, how so?
Well, Paul is writing years after that chaotic morning. He is looking back at that raw panic and synthesizing those terrifying facts into a clear confession. The text points out that Easter, in this context, is framed as something structurally massive. It says it is not merely the end of sadness. It is the definitive victory of Christ over sin and death for the sake of sinners.
It frames it as a permanent change in the state of the universe, like a factual victory over the two things that universally plague humanity, our brokenness, which the text calls sin, and our end, which is death.
Yeah, but this raises an important question. Let's really look at this logically.
Well,
If this entire load-bearing wall, this massive claim about defeating death, rests entirely on historical witness, who exactly were the witnesses chosen to carry this truth to the world? Because if you are claiming an event happened that alters human history, the people you put on a stage to testify to that event are critical to your credibility.
this is the part that just completely blew my mind.
Same here.
Because if you or I were running a modern PR campaign for a global movement today, we would be utterly ruthless about who we picked as our spokespeople.
100%.
We would want polished influencers. We would want people with absolutely spotless records, unshakable confidence, flawless resumes. We would want the strong, the wealthy, and the stable to represent our brand so people would actually take us seriously.
Right, you would want a team of people whose integrity could never be questioned.
Exactly.
But the text points out that the historical record does the exact opposite. It is a stunning reversal of what any strategist would advise.
It really is.
Paul lists the witnesses who supposedly saw the risen Christ, and he explicitly includes himself in that list. But he calls himself unworthy.
And let's be clear about his resume. He was actively hunting down and persecuting the early church before this.
Right.
He was literally an enemy of the movement.
Precisely. And the devotion really leans into the demographics of this witness list.
Yeah.
It highlights that the risen Jesus did not just appear to the strong and the stable.
No, not at all.
The text lists who the primary witnesses actually were.
Gotcha.
It was doubters, deniers, grieving women, confused disciples, and, like you said, a former persecutor.
Wait, let me stop you right there. Because from a purely strategic standpoint, that is a terrible lineup for credibility.
It's the worst.
If I am a skeptic living in the first century, why on earth would I believe a group of known cowards who abandoned their leader, a guy who famously doubted the whole thing, and a known enemy of the church? Like, why would anyone design a movement this way?
Well, that is exactly the friction historians look for. It's what historians sometimes call the criterion of embarrassment.
The criterion of embarrassment.
Yeah. Basically, if you were making up a myth to gain power and credibility, you would write yourself as the brave, steadfast hero who understood everything from the beginning.
Right. I'd make myself look great.
Exactly. You would never invent a story where the founders of your movement look like terrified, confused cowards who only believe it when the evidence is shoved in their faces.
That makes so much sense.
The unpolished, embarrassing nature of the witnesses actually lends weight to the historical authenticity of the claim. They didn't invent the story. The event happened to them, despite themselves.
It's like launching a tech startup and having your lead spokesperson be a guy who publicly trashed your product yesterday,
Yes.
backed up by a team of people who don't even fully understand how the app works yet. You just wouldn't do it unless the product was so undeniably real it spoke for itself.
Exactly. And the author of the devotion takes this historical reality and applies it to a profound theological point.
Yeah.
There is a sentence in this reading that really anchors the whole concept.
Which one?
It says, "Grace does not wait for a polished record. It meets people where they are and gives them a new future."
Grace does not wait for a polished record. Man! Think about how radically that flips the traditional script of basically every other system in the world.
Oh, completely.
Usually the rule is you clean yourself up, you get your life together, you fix your mistakes, you build a flawless resume, and then, and only then, you get to be part of the good news.
Right, you earn your way into the room.
Yes, you have to earn it.
But this text is arguing that the load-bearing truth of the universe operates on a completely different set of mechanics. The historical fact of the resurrection was intentionally entrusted to people whose lives were messy, fearful, and compromised. The unworthiness of the witnesses isn't an accident. It is the entire point.
Wow.
It proves the nature of the message itself.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, right now? Like, if you are sitting in traffic, commuting to a job that stresses you out, or you're folding laundry, or you're walking the dog,
Right.
how does a historical event from 2,000 years ago actually apply to your Tuesday? Because most of us know we are profoundly unpolished. We know we do not have spotless records.
Well, the application the text draws here is very direct, and it all comes back to that cause and effect relationship between history and your current reality.
Okay, lay it out for us.
The devotion unpacks the logical conclusion of this load-bearing truth. The text says living hope rests here. Christ died for sins and rose again. Therefore, guilt does not rule, death does not reign, and the church has something solid to stand on.
Okay, we need to pause and wrestle with the mechanics of that sentence, because the author says, therefore, guilt does not rule. Right.
But how exactly does an event in the past mechanically break the authority of a listener's guilt today? I mean, people walk around with a low-level hum of guilt all the time. How does one cancel out the other?
It's a great question. And we have to look at the theological mechanics the text is implying here, which is the concept of substitution or a debt being paid.
Okay.
Think of it in legal or financial terms. If you have a massive, unpayable debt, that debt rules your life. It dictates your stress, your future, your options. The debt collector has authority over you.
Right. You are legally liable, and you feel it every single day.
Exactly. Now imagine a wealthy benefactor steps in and legally pays that debt in full. And the bank issues a historical documented receipt of a zero balance.
Okay, I'm following.
Your feelings about the debt might take a while to catch up. You might still wake up in a cold sweat panicking about bankruptcy.
Yeah, the panic doesn't just vanish. Right. But mechanically, legally, the authority of that debt is broken. The debt collector no longer has the power to rule your life. Not because you feel peaceful, but because a transaction occurred.
Oh, that is such a clarifying way to look at it. The text is arguing that Christ's death and resurrection is the transaction. It is the historical receipt.
Yes.
So when the author says guilt does not rule, they aren't saying you will never feel guilty again. They are saying guilt has lost its legal authority over your identity.
Exactly.
It might still knock on the door of your mind, but it doesn't own the house anymore.
Precisely. It is a structural change to reality. Because the debt of sin is paid and death is defeated, you're no longer liable.
That's huge.
And the devotion gives a very specific physical next step to help the reader actually internalize this structural change.
What is it?
It suggests speaking this gospel aloud in one single sentence today. It asks the reader to literally vocalize, Christ died for sins and rose again, and that changes everything.
I really want to highlight how important that physical action is. Think about the psychological impact of actually vocalizing a truth rather than just reading it. We spend so much of our time trapped in our own heads, listening to our own internal echo chamber of anxieties, our own guilt, our own inner critic.
We really do.
And when you just passively read a concept, it can easily get drowned out by all that internal noise.
It remains abstract. It just becomes another thought floating in the soup of all your other thoughts.
Yes. But when you use your physical voice, when you speak a load-bearing truth out loud into the room you are standing in, you are actively interrupting that internal narrative.
That's powerful.
You are forcing your ears to hear a historical fact that combats your internal fear. You are declaring that the debt is paid.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you can clearly see why the devotion includes a specific closing prayer and blessings right after suggesting that action step.
Whoa, yeah.
The prayer explicitly asks God to keep the heart from drifting into lesser hopes and to let this truth stand at the center, steadying faith and strengthening joy.
Drifting. That is such a quiet, dangerous word.
It is, because the author understands human nature. We are incredibly prone to drift.
So true.
You don't usually intentionally dynamite your own foundation. You just slowly drift away from it. You start leaning your weight on things that were never designed to hold you up.
Yeah.
The vocalizing, the prayer, the blessings, they're all daily mechanisms to actively anchor the reader back to the facts of first importance.
We really do drift so easily. And honestly, we've gone on quite a journey today pulling this text apart. We started by looking at the architecture of belief itself, separating the decorative traditions from the structural, load-bearing truths, the firm historical lines of a death and a resurrection.
Then we moved into the gritty psychological reality of how people first process that impossible truth, the chaotic progression of fear meeting raw facts and eventually becoming faith. We saw that it wasn't a neat, sanitized process. It was a collision with reality.
And from there, we looked at the witnesses themselves. Not a polished, perfect PR team, but a beautifully messy group of doubters, deniers, and broken people. People whose very unworthiness proves the historical authenticity of the event and proves that grace meets you exactly where you are, rather than demanding you clean yourself up first.
Finally, we broke down the mechanics of applying that truth, recognizing that because the historical transaction is real, the debt is paid. Guilt loses its authority, and we can speak that hope aloud to interrupt our own natural tendency to drift.
It is a text that really demands to be more than just a passing thought. It demands to be the foundation of the house. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Something that builds directly on that warning in the text about our hearts drifting into lesser hopes.
I love that.
Think about your own life right now. Think about the house you are currently building. If the death and resurrection of Christ is meant to be the ultimate load-bearing wall, the single structural truth that holds up your identity, take a really hard look at the other structures in your life.
Yeah, that's a tough audit to do.
It is. Look at your career. Look at your reputation. Look at your financial security, your relationships, or even your own desire to have a perfectly polished record.
Yeah.
Are you accidentally treating those fragile temporary things as load-bearing walls?
Mm-hmm.
Are you expecting your job or your status to hold up the entire weight of your peace and your worth? Because if you are going to feel the whole house shaking every single time the wind blows or the market shifts.
It's just too much weight for those things.
Exactly. So what would happen if you let those things just be decorative? What if you let your career just be a career and let your reputation just be what it is and trusted the real foundation, the historical, unshakable grace that meets you right where you are to actually hold the weight of your life?
Wow.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep staying curious, keep auditing your own architecture, and keep seeking out those foundational truths in your own learning journey.